February 18, 1962. Palm Beach. Vinnie Torino watched Tommy the Shark Marconi make the biggest mistake of his life. 3 words about Marilyn Monroe. Crude, loud, stupid. President Kennedy stopped mid-conversation, turned, looked Tommy dead in the eye. 5 words that came out like winter wind: get him out of here. Now. Vinnie expected Secret Service to escort Tommy out. What he saw instead was his own wife, Maria, slip something into Tommy's drink. Tommy was dead before dessert. The president never knew. Maria caught Vinnie watching her and smiled. 50 years later, that smile still wakes him up screaming. Because now Vinnie knows what Maria really was, who she worked for, and why 3 more men from that party have died in the past month. The night JFK's 5 words changed everything. The night Vinnie learned his wife was the real killer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The manila envelope had no return address, no postmark. Just Vinnie's name written in block letters that made his arthritis-gnarled hands shake as he tore it open in his queen's kitchen. Inside, 5 photographs, black and white, professional quality, from that night. The first photo showed the grand ballroom of the Palm Beach mansion, crystal chandeliers casting shadows over men in expensive suits. Vinnie recognized faces he'd tried to forget. Politicians, mobsters, businessmen who moved money like other people moved air. The second showed Tommy the Shark Marconi, alive and grinning, a Cuban cigar between his yellowed teeth, still breathing, still stupid enough to think he belonged in that room with those people. The third made Vinnie's coffee mug slip from his fingers, ceramic shattering against linoleum. President Kennedy in profile, leaning toward a Secret Service agent, mouth slightly open, mid-sentence. Those 5 deadly words frozen in time. But it was the 4th photograph that stopped Vinnie's heart. Maria. His Maria. Beautiful in her white evening gown, standing behind the bar with a crystal decanter in one hand and something small, pill-sized, palmed in the other. Her face turned toward the camera, toward whoever had been watching her, toward whoever had been documenting her work. The 5th photograph was the worst. Vinnie himself, 23 years old, standing 3 feet behind JFK, eyes wide with horror as he watched his wife poison a man. The flash had caught him mid-realization, the exact moment he understood that the woman he'd married, the woman who made him breakfast every morning and hummed while she did dishes, was something else entirely. Someone had been watching them all. Someone had captured every moment of that blood-soaked evening. Someone who'd waited 50 years to remind Vinnie that he'd never really escaped that ballroom. His landline rang, the shrill tone cutting through the afternoon silence of his cramped apartment. Vinnie stared at the rotary phone, a relic from another era like himself, and let it ring. 8 times, 9, whoever it was hung up. The phone rang again immediately. This time he answered. "Yeah? Vincent Torino?" The voice was young, female, professional, but with an edge that reminded him uncomfortably of Maria. "Depends who's asking. My name is Rachel Chen Torino. I'm your son Michael's daughter." Vinnie's blood turned to ice water. Michael had been dead for 15 years. Heart attack at 47, probably brought on by the stress of having a father who'd never explained why his mother disappeared when Michael was 8 years old, why she'd simply vanished one Tuesday morning, leaving behind only a note saying she had to protect their family. "I don't have a granddaughter," Vinnie said carefully. "You do now. Michael married my mother in 1987. I was born in 1991. He never told you about us, did he?" The photograph stared up at Vinnie from his kitchen table. Maria's face, that knowing smile. The smile that had haunted him for 50 years because it wasn't the smile of a woman caught poisoning someone. It was the smile of a woman who'd wanted to be caught. By him, specifically. "What do you want?" Vinnie asked. "I'm an investigative journalist. I've been researching my family history, and I found some inconsistencies in my grandmother's death certificate. Maria Torino died June 15, 1962. But here's the thing, Grandpa. There's no body, no burial record, no witnesses to her death except you." Vinnie's chest tightened. The kid was smart, too smart. "I also found hospital records showing she was treated for facial reconstruction surgery in early 1962, before she died." "Plastic surgery, Grandpa. to make her look like someone else. The room spun slightly. Vinny gripped the phone tighter. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing. The game where 3 men from a 1962 Palm Beach party have died in the past month. All of them listed as natural causes, but all of them connected to that same event. Samuel Morrison, January 22nd. Anthony Calabrese, February 3rd. Joseph Rinaldi, February 14th. All were there that night, weren't they, Grandpa? Vinny's legs gave out. He slumped into his kitchen chair, staring at the photographs scattered across the table. Someone was cleaning house. Someone was eliminating witnesses. Someone who'd kept detailed records for 50 years was finally making their move. Where are you? He whispered. Downstairs. Apartment 2B. I've been your neighbor for 3 months. The line went dead. Vinny looked out his kitchen window down to the street, where a young Asian woman in a dark coat stood beside a silver sedan, phone still pressed to her ear. She looked up at his window and waved. Even from 4 stories up, he could see her smile. It was Maria's smile, knowing, dangerous, the smile of someone who'd been planning this moment for a very long time. Are you hooked? This story gets deeper and more twisted with each chapter. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow's chapter reveals the truth about what really happened to Marilyn Monroe and why Vinny's life was never really his own. Vinny's hand remained frozen on the window frame long after the silver sedan disappeared around the corner. The glass was cold against his palm, fogged with his uneven breathing. 3 months. The girl had been living 2 floors below him for 3 months, probably listening to his evening routine through the thin walls, the Mets games on his radio, his 2 a.m. trips to the bathroom, the nights when the dreams came and he'd wake up calling Maria's name. He shuffled back to the kitchen table where the photographs lay scattered like tarot cards predicting a future he'd spent 50 years trying to avoid. The coffee he'd spilled had seeped under the image of Tommy the Shark Marconi, staining the white border brown. Tommy, who'd been so proud of that Cuban cigar, who'd laughed too loud at his own jokes about Monroe's assets while she stood just 20 feet away in her shimmering dress. Tommy, who'd never made it to sunrise. Vinny's arthritis flared as he gathered the photos with shaking hands. The pain was worse when it rained, worse when he was stressed, worse when ghosts from 1962 came knocking on his door with Maria's smile. He tucked the images into his copy of the racing form, old habits from his bookmaking days, when hiding evidence became as natural as breathing. The apartment felt smaller now, crowded with memories he'd carefully packed away. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that barely fit a table for 2. But it had been enough. For 15 years after Maria vanished, he'd raised Michael here, teaching his son to make Sunday gravy and showing him how to iron his school shirts. Simple things, safe things, the kind of normal life that had nothing to do with presidents and poison and women who wore other people's faces. The framed photograph on his bedroom dresser caught the late afternoon light streaming through his blinds. Michael's high school graduation, 1972. Vinny in a borrowed suit that was too big, his son grinning beside him in cap and gown. Michael had never asked why his mother wasn't there that day. By then, 10 years had passed, and her absence had become a familiar ache rather than an open wound. But Michael had asked other questions over the years, careful questions. Why didn't Vinny have any friends from the old days? Why did he always pay cash for everything? Why did he check the locks on the door 3 times every night before bed? Questions that Vinny answered with shrugs and subject changes, protecting his son from a truth that could get them both killed. The radiator clanked to life, filling the apartment with its familiar metallic symphony. February in Queens was bitter, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and reminded you that winter always lasted longer than you wanted. Vinny pulled his cardigan tighter, the gray one Maria had knitted during their brief marriage, back when she was still pretending to be just a girl from Brooklyn who'd fallen for a small-time bookie with gentle hands and dreams bigger than his bank account. He'd believed it all, the shy smiles when he brought her flowers, the way she'd curl against him on Sunday mornings, tracing patterns on his chest while she talked about the children they'd have, the life they'd build. He'd believed she was real, that what they had was real, right up until the moment he watched her slip something into Tommy Marconi's champagne with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it before. The phone rang again. Vinny stared at it through 4 rings before answering. "You need time to process," said the voice. Rachel Chen Torino, the granddaughter he'd never known existed. I get that. This is a lot. You don't know anything about what this is, Vinny said. I know 3 people are dead. I know my grandmother isn't buried where her death certificate says she is. And I know you've been getting Social Security checks for a dead woman for 50 years. Vinny's stomach dropped. The Social Security fraud, that was federal. That was prison time, even at his age. I never... Relax. I'm not here to turn you in. I'm here because I think we're both in danger. Whoever sent those photographs isn't just taking a trip down memory lane. They're tying up loose ends. Through his kitchen window, Vinny could see Mrs. Chen from 3 walking her ancient Pomeranian. Normal life continuing its normal rhythm while his world came apart at the seams. The dog walker, the bodega owner counting register receipts, the teenagers sharing earbuds at the bus stop. None of them knew that a 73-year-old retired bookie was about to become the final chapter in a story that started with presidential secrets and ended with blood. What do you want from me? Vinny asked. The truth about what happened that night. The truth about who my grandmother really was. And the truth about who's killing everyone who was there to witness it. The line went quiet, except for the sound of their breathing. His labored, hers steady and patient. 1 hour, Rachel said finally. Then I'm coming up. Vinny hung up the phone and stood motionless in his kitchen for exactly 60 seconds, counting each heartbeat against his ribs. Then he moved with a speed that surprised even him, his arthritis forgotten in the surge of adrenaline that felt disturbingly familiar. The same chemical rush he'd experienced 50 years ago when survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead of men who killed for sport. The shoebox came out from under his bed first. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, Maria's wedding ring, a stack of love letters in her careful handwriting, and a small brass key that didn't fit any lock in his apartment. He'd kept these relics for 5 decades, telling himself they were memories of the woman he'd loved before he learned who she really was. Now they felt like evidence in a case that was finally going to trial. Next came the .38 revolver from behind the loose baseboard in his bedroom closet. He'd bought it in 1963, a year after that night, when paranoia became his most trusted companion. The weight of it in his palm was both foreign and familiar, like riding a bicycle after decades of walking. He checked the cylinder out of habit, still loaded, still ready, but as he sat on his bed, gun in one hand and Maria's wedding ring in the other, a memory surfaced unbidden. Not from that blood-soaked night in Palm Beach, but from 3 weeks later, when she'd come home. Maria had simply appeared in their Brooklyn apartment one Tuesday evening as if she'd never left, hanging her coat on the hook by the door like she'd done every day of their marriage. Vinny had been sitting at their kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes from 3 days earlier, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and newspapers with headlines about Marilyn Monroe's suicide. When he looked up and saw his wife silhouetted in the doorway, he'd actually wondered if he'd finally lost his mind completely. "Hello, Vincent," she'd said, and her voice had been different, harder, like she'd stopped pretending to be someone soft enough for him to love. "You're supposed to be dead," he'd whispered. "I am dead. Maria Torino died the night Tommy Marconi did. You need to remember that." She'd moved around their apartment with the efficiency of someone packing for a trip she'd planned long ago. Into a small suitcase went clothes he'd never seen her wear, documents he didn't know she possessed, and a photograph that made his blood freeze. Marilyn Monroe, laughing at some Hollywood party, looking exactly like his wife's sister. The surgery was good, Maria had said, catching him staring at the photograph, but not perfect. Close enough for dim lighting and drunk men, but not close enough to fool cameras. Or coroners. That's why she had to die first. She? The real Marilyn. She got careless. Started talking about things she shouldn't have known, making threats about going public with secrets that weren't hers to tell. Maria had folded a silk scarf with meticulous care, so he gave her what she wanted, publicity, the kind that lasts forever. Vinny had gripped the edge of the table, feeling reality shift beneath him like ice cracking on a frozen pond. "You killed her?" "I replaced her. For one night. Long enough to convince the right people that Marilyn Monroe died of an overdose in her own bed, far away from Palm Beach parties and presidential secrets." Maria had zipped the suitcase closed with a sound like a coffin lid settling. "Tommy Marconi died because he recognized me. because he was stupid enough to announce it to a room full of witnesses. And JFK? Jack never ordered anyone killed. He just whispered 5 words to his Secret Service agent. I don't see anything happening. Permission to look the other way while someone else solved his problem. She'd kissed Vinny's forehead then, her lips cold against his skin. I have to go now, for both our sakes. But Vincent, her fingers had gripped his chin, forcing him to meet her eyes. If anyone ever asks what happened to your wife, you tell them she died the same night Marilyn Monroe did. You tell them she was buried in Queens, and you visit her grave every Sunday. You become a widower, Vincent. You grieve, you move on, and you never ever let anyone know that Maria Torino lived long enough to become someone else entirely. The last thing she'd said, standing in their doorway with her suitcase in hand and another woman's face, take care of our son. Now, 50 years later, Vinny understood why that memory had chosen this moment to surface. Rachel wasn't just his granddaughter. She was proof that Maria had kept watching, kept planning, kept pulling strings from whatever shadows she'd disappeared into. The girl downstairs with Maria's smile and a journalist's questions wasn't just investigating a family mystery. She was the final move in a game his wife had started the night she poisoned Tommy Marconi. Vinny tucked the gun into his waistband and walked to his front door. His fingers hesitated on the deadbolt. Once he opened this door, once he let Rachel Chen Torino into his apartment, there would be no going back to his quiet life of racing forms and Mets games and pretending the past was buried. But the past had never been buried. It had been growing, gaining strength, waiting for the right moment to bloom into something that would destroy whatever was left of Vincent Torino. He turned the lock and opened the door. Rachel stood in the dim hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing that same knowing smile that had haunted Vinny's dreams for 50 years. Up close, the resemblance was even more unsettling. Not just Maria's mouth, but the way she tilted her head when she studied him, like she was solving a puzzle she'd been working on her entire life. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, stepping past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. Vinny closed the door but didn't lock it. His hand stayed near his waistband where the .38 pressed against his hip. Maybe I have. She set the coffee cups on his kitchen table, pushing aside yesterday's racing form. If she noticed the slight bulge where the photographs were hidden, she didn't mention it. Instead, she studied the apartment with a journalist's eye. The framed picture of Michael, the emergency $20 bills taped under the windowsill, the double-bolted front door. You've been waiting for this day for a long time, Rachel said. It wasn't a question. I've been waiting for a lot of things. Doesn't mean I want them to happen. She laughed, and the sound was pure Maria. Musical, but with edges sharp enough to draw blood. I called my editor before I came up, told him I was onto something big, something that could rewrite the Kennedy assassination timeline. Vinny's chest tightened. Your editor have a name? Why? You planning to call him? I'm planning to figure out who I can trust. These days, that's a very short list. Rachel opened her purse and pulled out a digital voice recorder, setting it beside the coffee cups. Do you mind? I do, actually. Vinny reached over and switched it off. Some conversations shouldn't be recorded. Because they're dangerous? Because they're true. For the first time since she'd arrived, Rachel's confidence flickered. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was suddenly cold. How well did you know my father? Really know him, I mean. The question hit Vinny sideways. Michael was a good kid, quiet, asked too many questions but never pushed when I didn't answer them. He used to have nightmares about a woman in a white dress who would stand at the foot of his bed and whisper things he couldn't understand. This went on for years after my grandmother died. Rachel's fingers made air quotes around the last word. My mother thought it was just childhood trauma from losing his mother so young. But what if it wasn't trauma? What if it was memory? Vinny's blood turned to ice water. Michael had been 8 when Maria left, old enough to remember faces, voices, the way his mother smelled like jasmine and cigarettes, but not old enough to understand why she'd started looking different in those final weeks, why her voice had changed, why she'd begun checking the locks twice before bed. Memory of what? Of her coming back, watching him, making sure you both stayed quiet about what really happened that night. Rachel leaned forward and her voice dropped to a whisper. She never really left, did she? She's been watching your family for 50 years. Before Vinny could respond, the building's front door buzzed, not the short, polite buzz of someone visiting, the long, insistent buzz of someone who knew how to gain entry to places they weren't welcome. Vinny moved to his kitchen window and peered down at the street. A black sedan was parked across from the building, engine running. Two men in dark coats stood on the sidewalk, and even from 4 stories up, Vinny could see they weren't here for a social call. "How many people did you tell about this visit?" he asked Rachel. "Just my editor." "Why?" The building's front door opened, and Vinny heard footsteps in the stairwell, measured, professional, the sound of men who did this kind of work for a living. His neighbors would assume they were maintenance workers or city inspectors. They'd smile politely and step aside, never realizing they were watching a cleanup operation 50 years in the making. "Because someone doesn't want us having this conversation." Vinny pulled the .38 from his waistband, and Rachel's eyes went wide. "How's your relationship with fire escapes? I'm not running anywhere until you tell me what happened to my grandmother." "Your grandmother became someone else and disappeared into a witness protection program that doesn't officially exist." The footsteps were on the second floor now, moving with purpose toward the staircase. "The 3 men who died this month? They all figured that out. They all tried to find her. And now someone's decided it's time to close the book on everyone who was in that Palm Beach ballroom." Vinny moved toward his bedroom window where the fire escape offered their only route out. "Including us." The footsteps stopped outside his door. Rachel grabbed her purse and followed him, her coffee growing cold on the table beside the voice recorder she'd never get to use. Behind them, someone knocked on the front door, polite, professional, the kind of knock that came right before the door got kicked in. Vinny's bedroom window hadn't been opened in 3 years, and the painted frame fought him like it was defending his life. The fire escape beyond was slick with February ice, the metal rungs gleaming like black teeth in the afternoon gloom. Rachel pressed against his back, her breathing sharp and quick as the knocking at the front door became more insistent. "Move," Vinny hissed, forcing the window up with a screech of protesting wood. The cold air hit them like a slap, carrying the smell of car exhaust and something else, cigarette smoke from the alley below, professional smoke, the kind men used to calm their nerves before they went to work. They were surrounded. "Mr. Torino?" The voice through the front door was calm, conversational. "We'd like to speak with you about some photographs you received today." Rachel's hand found Vinny's shoulder, her fingers digging into his cardigan. "How do they know about—" "Because this was never about keeping secrets," Vinny whispered, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. "This was about gathering everyone who knew the truth in one place. The photographs, your visit, even this conversation. We've been herded." The front door exploded inward with a splintering crash that shook the entire apartment. Vinny pushed Rachel through the window onto the fire escape, his arthritic joints screaming as he followed. Behind them, he could hear professional footsteps moving through his kitchen, his living room, searching with the methodical efficiency of men who'd done this before. The fire escape swayed under their combined weight, 50 years of Queens weather having done nothing for its structural integrity. Rachel started down the metal stairs, but Vinny grabbed her arm. "Not down. Up, up. That's the roof. We'll be trapped. The roof connects to the next building. From there, we can reach the subway entrance on Northern Boulevard." Vinny's breath came in white puffs as they climbed. "Your grandmother taught me that, back when she was still pretending to be someone who needed escape routes." They reached the roof as voices echoed from his apartment below, angry voices discovering an empty bedroom and an open window. The Queens skyline stretched around them, a maze of brick and fire escapes and satellite dishes that had once seemed like home but now felt like a hunting ground, designed by someone who understood exactly how trapped prey thought. Rachel pulled out her cell phone, but Vinny knocked it from her hands before she could dial. The device skittered across the tar paper roof and disappeared over the edge. "They're tracking everything," he said. "Your phone, your editor, probably your credit cards. This whole thing was orchestrated. By who?" But Vinny was staring at something that made his blood freeze. Across the alley, on the roof of the building they'd been heading toward, a figure in a long coat stood silhouetted against the gray sky. Even at this distance, even after 50 years, he knew that posture, the way she held her shoulders, the tilt of her head as she watched them with patient satisfaction. "By her," he whispered. Maria stepped into the light, and Vinny saw what 5 decades had done to the woman he'd married. Her hair was silver now, pulled back in an elegant chignon that belonged to charity galas, not Queen's rooftops. Her face bore the refined lines of expensive surgery and careful maintenance, the kind of aging that money could control. She wore a black cashmere coat that probably cost more than Vinny's annual rent, and when she smiled, her teeth were perfect white pearls. She raised her hand in a small wave, casual and intimate, like she was greeting an old friend at a neighborhood restaurant. "Hello, Vincent," she called across the alley, her voice carrying clearly in the winter air. "You look well. Retirement suits you." Rachel stared at the figure on the opposite roof, then at Vinny. "That's her? That's my grandmother?" "That's the woman who replaced your grandmother," Vinny said. "The question is who she really was before that." Maria began walking along the edge of her building, keeping pace with them as they moved toward the far end of the roof. "I see you've met Rachel. Beautiful girl. She gets her curiosity from her father and her timing from me. Did you know she's been researching this story for 3 years? Ever since she found those Social Security records." The sound of splintering wood echoed from below as the men in Vinny's apartment kicked in his bedroom door. They'd discover the open window in seconds, and then the real hunt would begin. 3 years, Maria continued, her voice conversational despite the distance between them. 3 years of careful investigation, building sources, creating a paper trail that would lead her exactly where I wanted her to go. To you, Vincent. Because you're the only one left who remembers what really happened that night. And sometimes, for a story to truly end, it needs to be told first. She stopped walking and turned to face them fully. The photographs were just the invitation. Rachel was the bait. But you, my dear husband, you're the final witness. And after 50 years of keeping my secrets, don't you think it's time we discussed the price of your silence? The price of his silence. Vinny stared across the alley at the woman who had worn his wife's face for 3 months, before disappearing into a life he'd never imagined. The wind whipped between the buildings, carrying her words like poison through his veins. "You want to know about prices?" Vinny shouted back, his voice cracking with 50 years of buried rage. "Let me tell you about prices, Maria. I buried an empty coffin. I raised our son alone while he had nightmares about his dead mother who kept visiting him in the dark. I've spent half a century jumping at shadows because I thought I was protecting a secret that could destroy a presidency." Rachel grabbed his arm. "What are you talking about?" But Vinny couldn't stop now. The dam had burst, and everything he'd swallowed for 5 decades came pouring out. JFK never ordered anyone killed that night. He just whispered, "I don't see anything happening," and walked away. 5 words that gave permission for someone else to solve his Marilyn Monroe problem. But it wasn't his Secret Service who poisoned Tommy Marconi. Maria's smile widened across the distance between them. "Very good, Vincent. Tell the girl the rest." "It was you." The words felt like broken glass in Vinny's throat. "You were already there, already in place as Marilyn's body double for some CIA operation I never understood. When Tommy recognized you, when he started making noise about the real Marilyn being dead, you slipped something into his drink. Made it look like a heart attack." The footsteps in his apartment had reached the bedroom. Voices echoed through the open window behind them, professional, calm, discussing angles of approach. "But here's what I never understood," Vinny continued, backing toward the edge of the roof with Rachel. "Why did you come home after? Why risk exposing yourself to tell me you were leaving? You could have just vanished." "Because I needed you to believe in the lie," Maria called back. "I needed a grieving widower who would visit an empty grave every Sunday, who would raise our son to believe his mother died tragically young. I needed someone whose pain was so genuine that no one would ever question your story." Rachel's face had gone white. "You used him. For 50 years you used his grief as cover." "I gave him a purpose," Maria corrected. "Vincent was never meant for great things. He was a small-time bookie with small dreams and smaller courage. But loving a dead woman? Keeping faith with a ghost? That he could do beautifully." The words hit Vinny like bullets. Not because they were cruel, but because part of him recognized their truth. He had been ordinary. He had been small. He had spent 50 years defining himself by the woman he'd lost rather than the man he could have become. But Maria had made one fatal miscalculation. "You're wrong about one thing," Vinny said, pulling the .38 from his waistband. The gun felt steady in his hand now, no longer foreign. "I wasn't too small for courage, I was saving it up. Vincent, don't be foolish. You can't reach me from there, and my people have surrounded the building. There's nowhere to run." "I'm not running." Vinny turned the gun not toward Maria, but toward the roof access door behind them, where the first of her men was about to emerge. "And I'm not aiming at you." The door exploded outward as two men in dark coats stepped onto the roof, professional and confident. They expected to find cornered prey. Instead, they found a 73-year-old man who had finally remembered what it felt like to be dangerous. Vinny's first shot caught the lead man's center mass. His second sent the other diving for cover behind an air conditioning unit. The sound echoed between the buildings like thunder, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. "You see, Maria?" Vinny called out, as he grabbed Rachel's hand and pulled her toward the fire escape on the opposite side of the roof. "That's the difference between us. You spent 50 years planning this moment, orchestrating every move, thinking you could control people like chess pieces." They reached the edge of the roof, where another fire escape led down to an alley that connected to Northern Boulevard. Behind them, more men were emerging from the roof access, moving with careful precision now that they knew their target was armed. "But you forgot something important," Vinny continued, helping Rachel onto the fire escape. "I'm not the same broken man you left behind. 50 years of guilt and grief don't make a person weaker. They make them willing to lose everything, because they've already lost the only thing that mattered." Maria's voice carried across the alley one final time, and for the first time since she'd appeared, it held something other than cold confidence. It held confusion, the sound of someone whose perfect plan had encountered variables she'd never calculated. "Vincent, wait. You don't understand. There's more you need to know about Rachel." But Vinny was already descending into the shadows, his granddaughter beside him, finally understanding that some secrets were worth dying to protect, and others were worth killing to reveal. The alley behind Vinny's building stretched like a concrete canyon, lined with dumpsters and delivery trucks that provided precious cover as they descended the fire escape. Rachel's hands shook on the metal rungs, her designer boots slipping on the ice-slicked steps, but she kept moving. Above them, Maria's voice echoed off the brick walls with increasing desperation. "She's not who you think she is, Vincent. Rachel isn't Michael's daughter." The words hit Vinny like a physical blow, but he didn't stop descending. Couldn't stop. Not with armed men converging on their position from 3 directions. But the seed of doubt was planted now, growing like cancer in his chest as he watched the young woman who claimed to be his granddaughter navigate the fire escape with surprising agility. "Don't listen to her," Rachel said, sensing his hesitation. "She's trying to divide us. Classic interrogation technique. Introduce doubt about allies when the situation gets desperate. Interrogation technique." The phrase struck Vinny as oddly professional for a newspaper reporter, but there was no time to analyze it. They reached the alley floor just as black sedans appeared at both ends of the narrow passage, engines purring like predatory cats. The trap was closing with mechanical precision. "This way." Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him toward a service entrance halfway down the alley. She produced a set of lockpicks from her purse with practiced efficiency, working the heavy door's mechanism while Vinny watched the approaching vehicles with growing dread. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. Columbia Journalism Program has a surprisingly comprehensive course on investigative techniques. The lock clicked open. Also, my mother was a locksmith before she married my father. Another professional skill. Another convenient explanation. Vinny's instincts, honed by 50 years of life on the margins, were screaming warnings he couldn't afford to hear. Not yet. Not until they were safe. They slipped into the building's basement, a maze of storage units and heating equipment that connected to the subway access tunnel beneath Northern Boulevard. Rachel moved through the labyrinth like she'd studied the blueprints, leading them past dusty furniture and Christmas decorations toward a service corridor that should have been locked. It wasn't. "Funny thing about investigative journalism," Vinny said as they emerged into the subway tunnel, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. It usually involves asking questions instead of having all the answers. Rachel stopped walking. When she turned to face him, the frightened granddaughter expression had disappeared entirely, replaced by something colder and infinitely more professional. Very good. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Figure what out? That you've been playing me from the moment you walked into my apartment? That this whole family reunion was as staged as everything else? Vinny kept the .38 pointed at the ground, but his grip tightened on the handle. The question is who you're really working for. Does it matter? You're going to be dead in 10 minutes either way. The mask was off now. Rachel's voice had lost its nervous edge, replaced by the flat confidence of someone accustomed to violence. She pulled a sleek automatic from her purse, not the fumbling gesture of a frightened civilian, but the smooth draw of a professional. Let me guess, Vinny said, backing slowly down the tunnel. Maria recruited you years ago. Probably some CIA Black Ops program that officially doesn't exist. Train pretty young operatives to play whatever role the mission requires. Grieving granddaughter, investigative reporter, concerned citizen. Close. I've been Rachel Torino for 3 years now. Long enough to build a complete identity. Long enough to make this moment feel authentic when it finally came. She advanced steadily, the gun never wavering. The real Rachel died in a car accident in Portland. College student, journalism major, conveniently estranged from her East Coast family. Perfect cover for someone who needed to approach you without raising suspicions. Vinny's heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind was finally clear for the first time in months. So what's the end game? Why the elaborate setup? Maria could have had me killed any time in the last 50 years. Because killing you wasn't enough. She needed to discredit you first. Needed to make sure that when your body was found, it would be alongside evidence that proved you were just a delusional old man telling increasingly wild stories about long-dead presidents and movie stars. Rachel's smile was Maria's smile, beautiful and terrible. The photographs, the secret meetings, the paranoid behavior, it all builds a perfect psychological profile. Grief-stricken widower finally snaps, threatens innocent journalist, dies in shootout with police. The sound of approaching trains vibrated through the tunnel floor. In the distance, Vinny could hear voices, Maria's people, closing the final escape routes with methodical precision. But something in Rachel's explanation didn't fit. Something important. If this was just about discrediting me, he said, why did Maria tell me you weren't really my granddaughter? Why give away the game? For the first time, Rachel's confidence flickered. Because she's getting old, and old people make mistakes under pressure. Or because she wasn't talking to me, Vinny said quietly. She was talking to you. Rachel's gun hand wavered for the first time since she dropped her mask. The fluorescent lights of the subway tunnel cast harsh shadows across her face, revealing something Vinny had missed before. The subtle tension of someone who'd been playing a role so long she'd begun to forget which side she was really on. That's impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maria's been running me for 3 years. I know exactly who I work for. Do you? Vinny took a careful step closer, reading the confusion in her eyes like pages from a book he'd been studying his whole life. Because, from where I'm standing, it looks like she just burned you. Told me you were a fake while you could hear every word. That's not protecting an asset. That's cutting one loose. The train sounds grew louder, accompanied by the echo of footsteps in the service corridor behind them. Maria's cleanup crew was closing the final gaps, but they were moving cautiously now, aware that their quarry had already proven more dangerous than expected. She needed you to know, Vinny continued, his voice gentle despite the gun pointed at his chest. Needed me to figure out what you really were before this was over. The question is why? Rachel's professional composure cracked completely. Stop talking. You're trying to manipulate me. Kid, I've been manipulated by experts for 50 years. I know what it feels like, and this isn't it. Vinny gestured toward the tunnel entrance where shadows were beginning to move. This is what it looks like when the people who trained you decide you know too much to walk away clean. The first of Maria's men appeared at the far end of the tunnel, 2 figures in dark coats moving with tactical precision. They saw Rachel holding Vinny at gunpoint and stopped, taking positions behind concrete support pillars, waiting for orders, professional, patient. "You see that?" Vinny asked. "They're not here to extract you. They're here to contain the situation. All of it." Rachel's breathing quickened as the terrible logic became clear. "I'm the loose end. After I kill you, I become the unstable operative who went rogue, threatened civilians, had to be eliminated for public safety. Now you're thinking like your grandfather's granddaughter." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "DNA doesn't lie, sweetheart. I spent 60 years learning to read people, and you've got Michael's eyes when you're angry. You've got my Carmela's stubborn chin when you set your jaw like that." Vinny's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Maria didn't replace some dead college student from Portland. She recruited the real Rachel Torino, told you whatever story she needed to make you believe your family had abandoned you, made you angry enough to want revenge. The gun in Rachel's hand began to shake. "That's not possible. My parents died when I was 12. I've been in the system since then. Your father died 6 months ago in a VA hospital in Newark. Lung cancer. He never stopped looking for you." Vinny pulled a worn photograph from his wallet. Michael in his army uniform, standing next to a young woman with Rachel's dark hair and stubborn chin. "Your mother, Sarah. She's alive too, living in Phoenix, working as a school counselor. She calls me every Christmas, asking if I've heard anything about her missing daughter who disappeared from a foster home in Oregon 15 years ago." The photograph fluttered from Rachel's nerveless fingers. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face, washing away 3 years of carefully constructed lies. "She told me they never wanted me, that they gave me up because I was too difficult. She told you what you needed to hear to become the weapon she needed. Someone with legitimate family connections. Someone whose grief and anger would feel authentic because it was." Vinny stepped closer, close enough to reach out and gently lower her gun. "But here's what Maria never counted on. Family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. And right now, you get to choose who you really are." The men at the end of the tunnel were advancing now, their patience exhausted. Radio chatter echoed off the concrete walls as they coordinated their approach, preparing to eliminate both targets and close this chapter of Maria's 50-year secret forever. Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked up, she was no longer the cold professional or the frightened granddaughter. She was someone entirely new, a young woman who'd just discovered she had a family worth fighting for. "So what do we do now, Grandpa?" Vinny smiled for the first time in months. "Now we remind these bastards that Torinos don't go down easy." He raised his, 38 toward the approaching figures. "And then we go home and call your mother." The gunfight in the tunnel lasted exactly 43 seconds. Not because Vinny counted, but because that's how long it took for Rachel to empty 2 clips, with the precision of someone who'd been trained by people who didn't believe in warning shots. When the echo of the final bullet faded, 3 of Maria's men lay motionless on the concrete, and the tunnel had fallen silent except for the distant rumble of the approaching train. Rachel helped Vinny to his feet, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of people who'd just discovered they were still alive when they shouldn't be. His shoulder burned where a bullet had creased it, but the pain felt distant, unimportant. What mattered was the way Rachel's hand stayed steady in his as they walked toward the subway platform, and how she'd called him Grandpa without hesitation when the shooting started. "She'll come after us again," Rachel said as they waited for the train. "Maria doesn't leave loose ends. Let her come." Vinny dabbed at his shoulder with a handkerchief, wincing slightly. "I'm tired of running from ghosts." But Maria never came. The official story, when it finally emerged 3 weeks later, was simple and sanitized. A gas leak explosion in an abandoned CIA safe house in Astoria had claimed the life of a woman whose fingerprints matched those of someone who'd been declared dead in 1962. The investigation was handled quietly by federal authorities, who seemed remarkably uninterested in asking difficult questions about how a dead woman had lived 50 years beyond her own funeral. Vinny read about it in his morning paper while sitting in the same diner where everything had started, drinking coffee that tasted exactly the same as it had a month ago. Some things, he reflected, were immune to change. The revelation brought him no satisfaction, only the hollow recognition that the woman he'd loved for 73 years had finally died for real this time. Rachel found him there an hour later, sliding into the booth across from him with the careful grace of someone still learning how to be herself instead of whoever the situation required. She'd cut her hair shorter, let the expensive dye job grow out to reveal natural brown streaks that reminded him powerfully of Michael at her age. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm an old man sitting in a diner, drinking bad coffee and reading about the death of someone who died before you were born." Vinny folded the paper carefully, creasing the edges the way he'd been doing for 5 decades. "I've been better." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning crowd cycle through their routines, delivery drivers grabbing quick breakfasts, office workers checking phones, retirees like himself marking time between doctor's appointments, ordinary people living ordinary lives, blissfully unaware that their world had almost been turned upside down by secrets buried in a Palm Beach mansion 60 years ago. "I talked to my mother yesterday," Rachel said finally. Vinny looked up from his coffee. "And?" "She cried for 20 minutes. Then she got angry. Then she cried some more." Rachel's smile was tentative but genuine. "We're going to meet next week. Phoenix. She's making dinner. That's good. Family dinners are important. You could come with me, if you wanted." The invitation hung between them like a bridge across 60 years of loneliness. Vinny considered it seriously, imagined himself sitting at Sarah's table, trying to explain 3 generations of Torino family history to a daughter-in-law he'd never met, attempting to build relationships from the wreckage of all the years they'd lost. "Maybe next time," he said. "You two have a lot of catching up to do first." Rachel nodded, understanding. "What will you do?" "What I've always done. Get up tomorrow, read the paper, complain about the coffee." Vinny gestured toward the window, where Queen's morning life continued its eternal rhythm. "The difference is, now I know why I'm doing it." "Which is?" "Because ordinary is enough. Because small dreams and smaller courage are still worth something when they're real." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Because sometimes the best thing you can do is just keep going until someone who needs you finds their way home." Rachel squeezed back, and for a moment they were just a grandfather and granddaughter sharing breakfast in a Queen's diner. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, exactly the kind of small moment that Maria had spent 50 years trying to convince him wasn't worth living for. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent to their story, and Vinny found peace in that indifference. He'd spent half a century believing he was carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. Now he understood that history was just another word for all the small choices that ordinary people made when no one was watching. The coffee still tasted terrible, but somehow that felt exactly right.